ladies and gentlemen, we're just about to get started. My name is Brandon Powell. I'm the program coordinator here at the Barron Art Center. I'd like to welcome you here tonight. We've had Maryann here for countless lectures at this point, Maryann. I don't recall how many we've had, and we're very excited to have her back. She's been working so hard for the past 2 months on this one lecture, and I know, because she's been here quite a few times, we've been sort of ironing out some computer things and images and things that we want to talk about, but we're very grateful that Maryann gives her time here at the Barron Art Center. In fact, Maryann has 2 additional lectures in her American Art series. They're afternoon lectures. The information is on your seat. Tonight, if you'd like to sign up for those, please do so. Just go right over into the office. And just a quick introduction to Maryann. Maryann received her BA in Art History from Drew University and her MA from Rutgers University. With 20 years on lecturing experience, Maryann has lectured in various venues, including the Seabourn, Crystal, and Regent cruise ships. And in 2009, Maryann has lectured at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Rutgers University. So without any further ado, please welcome Maryann.
Thank you. Before we begin, I think I have to say a thanks to the people who have helped me with this lecture, because there are certain things that I just needed. First of all, I want to thank Cynthia. She's not here, but she was the one that asked me to please write up the proposal, and which I then submitted. And secondly, I have to thank Brandon, because he was my rock. I was coming in 2 or 3 times a week, and I was waiting for him to go and hide when he saw me coming. All right? I'd also want to thank Roxanne Cantillo, who managed to dig up a document that I needed. I didn't even have to give her a shovel. She dug it up, okay? And I also want to thank a doctor who's not here today, but Dr. Warren Buck, who is my physician and who answered certain medical questions for me, so that when I impart it to you, I know it's correct. Okay, we're starting with the first portrait of George Washington, which was done by William Dunlap, who lived in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, and went to visit the Horn family at Rocky Hill, New Jersey, where Washington was staying. At that time, Princeton was the capital of the United States, okay? Now, Washington was a frequent guest there. Horn asked Washington to sit for Dunlap, and he complied. Dunlap, and this is an exact quote from William Dunlap's biography, he said, "I was astonished when the simple Yankee sentinels, deceived by my fine clothes, saluted me as I passed daily. To be noticed as a young painter was delicious." Well, the work, as you can see, is rather awkward. Washington's face is kind of flat. If you look at the epaulets on the shoulder, they're not really well done. It looks like strings from a mop, you know, and it was not very good. But there is a reason. When he was still in Perth Amboy, his father had a store in Perth Amboy and had fought at the French and Indian Wars and decided to settle in Perth Amboy. There was a fireplace was on. He was near the fireplace. A cinder came out and went into his eye, so that one of his eyes was compromised. And that's the reason why the painting looks like that, all right? Now, this painting, however, hangs in Congress in a private room. It was not damaged on January 6th. On January 21st, the New York Times reported that a number of paintings were damaged, but it said the oldest painting of George Washington was in a private room. It was this painting, okay? Throughout the war, George Washington would spend more time in New Jersey than in any other state, crisscrossing it a number of times. Let me give you an example. In 1778, in June 21st, he's in Princeton. In June 26th, he's at Cranberry. In June 28th, he's at Englishtown. And July 3rd, they marched 20 miles from Englishtown to New Brunswick in 100-degree heat without any water. And on June 4th to the 7th, he is in New Brunswick, and he learns of the enemy dead, 300 enemy dead at the Battle of Monmouth. And by July 11th, he's in Paramus. Now, how do I know this? Because George Washington wrote dispatches to the Continental Congress, but also letters to his family, and he would put the date and where he was at that time, you see. All right, now, he had, George Washington and William Dunlap had two more contacts together. Two more encounters with William Dunlap, who was now writing and producing plays in New York City. In 1789, he posted a play called Darby's Return. It was set in the American Revolution. George Washington was a first night audience. And in 1798, another play called André, about John André, who was a spy. This time, for the first time, George Washington appeared as a character in the play. That's the first time we've seen him. Why won't this work? All right, now here's William Dunlap's picture. And if you look at the eye on the extreme left, you will see that there is damage, all right? He went on to not only just write plays, but he also wrote, in 1832, he wrote a book called The Arts and Arts of Early America. That book was published in 1832, and it was still in publication because it's the only book we have explaining the arts and the theater in early America. All right, now Benjamin Franklin. When Franklin was selected by Congress to be our envoy in France, the choice could not have been better. He was, had a very calm demeanor, he was very well known, and these things are needed for someone who is a diplomat. Now, when he went to France, he went as an envoy, and he had to present his credentials to Louis XIV. And it was the first time that the words United States were used for us, okay, in France when he went there. And of course, Louis spoke French, and so Louis would say Les États-Unis, which is United States in French, okay? But that was the first time that the phrase United States was used in reference to the 13 colonies. He also invented the harmonica. Now there's the harmonica. It's a musical instrument, believe it or not. It has a series of glasses, and you played with the glasses along the rim of the glasses, and you had water in it. Each water would give you a different tone. So he would play that harmonica. It was not particularly popular, but some people did buy them and have them in their homes. He also invented, as you know, a stove and bifocal glasses. And he established the postal system and lit the streets of Philadelphia, and also had the first fire company and also the hospital there as well. Now, in 1778, there is, of course, there he is with the lightning, okay? In 1778, the town of Exeter was changing its name to Franklin in honor of Benjamin Franklin. In return, they asked Franklin, would you please give a bell for our church? Well, Franklin went one better, okay? Instead, he responded with an offer of 116 books for the use of the town's residents. When the volumes arrived, a controversy arose over who should be allowed to use them. On November 20th, 1790, those attending Franklin's town meeting voted to lend the books to all Franklin inhabitants for free of charge. This vote established the Franklin Collection as the first public library in the United States. Now here is Sabdiel Boylston. You can see his date, 1679 to 1766. In 1721, a smallpox epidemic broke out in Boston, one of many outbreaks. Smallpox was endemic. It was just like COVID, okay? Boylston learned of an inoculation process. The inoculation process was actually innovated in around the 15th century in Constantinople. And he heard about this innovation from a Reverend Cotton Mather, who was one of the ministers in Boston, and so he agreed to try it. He inoculated his son and 2 of his slaves, and the son and 1 slave lived, the second slave died. But he also inoculated between 180 and 215 Bostonians who were willing to take the chance on his inoculation. But many people opposed his work. They threatened his family. They even threw a grenade into his house. He was arrested and released when he agreed to inoculate only those with government permission. Zabdiel was also the first doctor to perform surgery in America. In 1710, the successful removal of bladder stones, and in 1718, the removal of a breast tumor. I can only imagine the screams of the poor patients. Remember, there was no ether. We're going to talk about that later, okay? Oops, sorry. All right, now, here is Dr. John Warren. He graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1797 and spent 3 years studying in London, Edinburgh, and Paris because the Europeans were more advanced in medical knowledge. He is was the co-founder of the New England Journal of Medicine, which is still in existence. The picture he has shows a heart with a large aneurysmal tumor that was printed in the journal in 1812. A drawing of it was printed. In 1815, he was named professor of anatomy and surgery at Harvard Medical School. He founded the Massachusetts General Hospital, first founder, and was chief surgeon when it opened in 1821. Now, in 1846, he performed the first surgery with the use of anesthesia. He gave permission to Dr. William Morton to provide ether anesthesia while he performed a surgical removal of a neck tumor. And I'm going to show you where William Morton is. He's right here. He's holding a flask. In the flask is the ether, and you can see the patient is relaxed and the surgery is going on. Now, this painting, they had to have proof that this was done. I mean, you have to have some kind of proof. We didn't have photography, we didn't have videos or anything like that. But there was a large audience there of doctors. And there also was this artist, Robert Hinckley, who was there probably sketching, and then he did this painting as proof that the anesthesia worked. All right. Let's go on to Thomas Jefferson. He was a brilliant polymath, functioned at a genius level. He had a rigorous thirst for knowledge. He spent 5 years studying the law. He studied ethics, European history, and also practiced on his Stradivarius violin. But he would make out a plan. He would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. He wouldn't have breakfast until after 8 o'clock because he was studying. Then in the afternoon, from 8 to 12 noon, he did some more work. And after lunch, he read European history. So he was a very, very busy man, but he absorbed everything. He absolutely absorbed everything, was the most well-known gentleman with the highest degree of intelligence in the colonies. On June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee proposed to break away from England at the Continental Congress, all right? Many were in opposition of this, including the people from New York and New Jersey. Now, New Jersey sent the delegates, but they said to the delegates they were forbidden to consent to such a declaration. On June 11th, Adams and Jefferson were charged with writing the Declaration of Independence. Adams said to Jefferson, "You can write it 10 times better than I can." Jefferson said, "Well, they pressed me alone to undertake the draft. I consented, I drew it." Thomas Jefferson wrote 3 drafts in 3 weeks, laying down the principles and reforms of I'm calling it the DOI, the Declaration of Independence. Now, one of the authors of Thomas Jefferson's biography has said, quote, "The genius of Thomas Jefferson's writing lay in his ability to take deep and complicated concepts of history, law, and philosophy and clothe them in an easy, graceful, direct, almost simple language." Now, the one stumbling block there was, of course, was slavery. They had to put that aside because we had to create a nation. So they put it aside to worry about it another day. Of course, they didn't know what was going to happen in 1861. But they had to put it aside because the Southerners would not sign the Declaration if you had a clause on getting rid of slavery. Okay, September 3rd, Thomas Jefferson finally left Philadelphia for home. He took a new route. The first turnpike in America from Philadelphia to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. First turnpike road. And you know what the turnpike was? The pike was like, it looked almost like a medieval weapon with a point on it. It was this way. So you had to turn the pike to let the person pass. And chances are you had to pay. If you were on a horse, you might be 1 or 2 cents, and if you were bringing a wagon, it probably would be more. But on those early turnpikes, you actually had to pay money. Now, let me see here. Here is Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello. Thomas Jefferson was also an architect because he had a series of books by an architect named Andrea Palladio, who revived the classical architecture of the Romans in the 16th century. He revived it. Thomas Jefferson drew the plans with ruler and a compass of precise scale of the frontal elevation and the fireplace, carrying his measurements to the 4th or 5th decimal. Construction began in 1769. Black bricklayers came in to produce 45,000 bricks for his house. Now, here is the University of Virginia. He also designed all the public buildings in the University of Virginia, again in the Palladian style, which even today can be seen in certain things. The Palladian windows and whatnot have a beautiful beauty and grace to them, and of course the beautiful dome at the top, which is just so lovely. Now, Thomas Jefferson, I told you, was one who wanted to know everything. But he was too anxious to find out the Northwest Passage to the Pacific and get an accurate sense of resources when we purchased the New Orleans, the entire the entire state of Louisiana, and then some. All right, now. So he put his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, in charge of the Corps of Discovery. William Clark had field experience and knowledge of the frontier. He recruited 40 unmarried men and trained them. And in May of 1804, Clark set out with 30 men and met Lewis, who had 10 men, when they met in Missouri. So they went into the territory of Louisiana. And a few months later, a woman named Sacagawea, who was a Shoshone Indian, and her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, joined the group. Now, at the time, she was pregnant. And believe it or not, Lewis helped her to deliver the baby. Now, she was important because, first of all, she knew the Shoshone language. And there were other tribes there whose the language may have varied a little bit, but she still understood it. You know, it's like different variations of French or Spanish. So, and she was important too, because when they came to the tribes looked at these white men, but when they saw a woman and a baby, they realized that these people were not going to hurt us. You have traveling with a woman and a baby, you're not going to hurt. So, and of course, the entire Corps of Discovery, which I call it Corps of Discovery, actually loved the child. It was just wonderful to have a child with you. Now, so in 1805, the Corps of Discovery arrived at the Pacific Ocean. The return voyage began on March 23rd, 1806, and they arrived on September 23rd, back in Washington, to a hero's welcome. What about the statistics on this? Well, the cost, this is the map here, and there is Sacagawea. The cost was between $30,000 and $50,000. Of the 40 men who went, only one died. It was a man named Charles Floyd, who perished from a burst appendix. The area was mapped, locating mountain ranges and rivers. The tribes were identified and their language and customs were recorded, and artifacts of their culture were brought back. They had traveled 8,000 miles. They left without any horses, but were able to barter from some horses from the natives. Now, why didn't they take any horses? They had to pull all the wagons themselves. Because if you take horses, can you imagine what you have to feed the horse? You know, you have to take an enormous amount of hay or whatever to feed the horse. So they simply went without horses, but once they got to the Indian Territory, they were actually able to barter for horses. Now, Louisiana Purchase map. Well, it cost us $15 million, $3 million in gold, and our treasury didn't even have that, okay? Now, the remainder was financed, believe it or not, through a British bank, because we had paid all our debts for from the Revolution, and the English were willing to service us by giving us the money for it. The U.S. issued bonds that paid 12.5%. Can you imagine? Now, we had hoped to get just New Orleans for $10 million, but wait a minute here. Napoleon, they were afraid Napoleon was going to change his mind. Napoleon needed money to fight a war. He was always fighting a war. He even went to Russia and fought a war, right? So, Pierre Dupont was sent to France as the courier, and James Monroe and Robert Livingston negotiated the treaty. It was presented to Congress in October 17th, and within 3 days they had signed it. Boy, they were acting fast, not like they do today. They dither and whatnot. 3 days, because they were afraid that Napoleon was going to pull out of the deal, and they wanted that whole part. Now, they got good value for money. It was 828,000 square miles of land, 22.3% of modern U.S., 3 cents per acre. All are part of 15 states and provinces. Just what did they discover? Well, 122 species of animals with fish, forests, and furs. But the greatest wealth lay below the soil. The oil, the natural gas, the gold, the silver, the copper, the molybdenum. All of these today are needed to keep the wheels of industry running and developing initiatives, innovative technology to solve problems. Here is Sacagawea. This, I believe, is in South Dakota. The statue of her with the baby is in South Dakota. Here's John Copley, picture of Paul Revere. You know, there he is sitting at his craft. He was a silversmith. Manual work was not denigrated. Rather, it enhances the man and his personality. In 1770, he was responsible for the engraving of the Boston Massacre. There were several different versions, but Revere did the copper engraving, printed it up, and had it colored. This became the iconic image of the incident, and of course, this little piece of paper was passed throughout the whole 13 colonies, and it enraged everybody. And it actually was one of the flashpoints for the start of the revolution. Now, meanwhile, he also organized an intelligence and alarm system to keep tracks of the movements of the British forces. His midnight ride was part of this. He alerted everybody, and when Lexington and Concord battle took place, it was an absolute decimation of the British. In 1801, he opened up the first American copper mill in Canton, Massachusetts, producing rolled copper. Copper is soft; it can be rolled, and almost like with a rolling pin. And he also provided copper sheeting for the USS Constitution. All right, there is the Boston Massacre. And here is the equestrian statue of Paul Revere, which is in Boston. Oops, I'm sorry. Here. Okay, Charles Willson Peale. Peale was an artist who had studied with Benjamin West in London. Upon returning home, he joined the army and was with George Washington at Valley Forge and the Battle of Trenton and Princeton. The first images of oil in George Washington, here it is. Here is the first image of George Washington by Charles Willson Peale before the Declaration was issued. He wears the blue sash of the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. The Continental Congress had named him the General-in-Chief of the Army, okay? But they still had not settled little things here and there. Now, Peale was a very interesting man. This is also the second miniature he did of George Washington. At the request of Martha, he painted this miniature for her and as a remembrance for her if he were to die in battle. When he's named the general, he has to go in the front and he's the first one to get killed. And we were lucky. George Washington, somehow all the bullets went in the opposite direction. I don't know how, but my God. You know, there was something like 1,300 battles or skirmishes before we could free ourselves from the British. And when you think of that, and you think of the men who were injured or maimed or died, leaving a widow and children, you know what they sacrificed for our country to make us what we are today. Now, Peale established the very first museum in America because he had trained his sons and his daughters in painting, and they painted portraits of all the presidents and all the well-known people, and even the daughters. They were able to make a living with their painting. And in other words, he was treating his children equally. He was not ignoring the girls, okay? Now, he established in America for the first time the first public museum in America, which housed not only the art collection, but also the collection of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was given, when it was given to Thomas Jefferson, a few years later, it was given to his museum because it was the only museum in the United States, all right? Now, in 1850, the museum had to close because Peale was struggling to get government subsidies, but it failed. He could not run it any longer, okay? Now, in 1849, the items from the Lewis and Clark expedition were sold to P.T. Barnum, and many other things too. Not the paintings, but many other things too. Barnum stored them in a warehouse in New York City. The storehouse burned and all was lost. So we don't have the artifacts from the Lewis and Clark expedition, all right? Now, Peale was a very unusual man. He was the first to exhume the bones of a mastodon from a farm in New York State. He includes this picture here, this painting of his family, and even a picture of his dead wife, because he had two wives at that time. The first one had died. Now, he even had the water wheel there because there was water in the ditch, and so they had to get the water out, okay? And he took all those mastodon bones, and they were shown in the museum. Now, this is his self-portrait, done 5 years before he died. Peale did this self-portrait. I think he wanted to be remembered this way, as a man dedicated to teaching and opening doors for others to the wonders of the world. Now we're introducing a lady, Dolly Madison. She was to define the role of the First Lady in many ways. She married Madison in 1794, a year after her losing her husband, her month-old son, her mother and father-in-law to a yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia. For some reason, every few years, yellow fever would hit in Philadelphia. Now, her oldest son, however, survived. She served as a hostess for the widow Thomas Jefferson, and in 1814, we know the British invaded the District of Columbia, and she was ordered the 1796 Peel portrait of George Washington to be taken down by her slave, Paul Jennings, and under, quote, under no circumstances allow it to fall into the hands of the British, unquote. The frame had to be broken and the painting rolled up because it was so large. It was very awkward. Roll it up, and they gave it to two men to be hidden. So the painting was saved. Meanwhile, she and her son were still in the White House. The British were in D.C., and if she were captured, and she and her son were captured, they would have been hostages. All right, now, she was a brilliant hostess, first to serve ice cream at the White House, of course. It was a sensation. In those days, a dinner was judged by the dessert, not by the regular food, but by the dessert, and if it was sweet enough with sugar and the spices and everything else. Now here is Benjamin Latrobe. Latrobe, Pennsylvania is named for him. Now, she was to define the role of, Benjamin Latrobe, born in Britain and trained as an architect. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson named him surveyor of public buildings. He spent 14 years working on the D.C. projects. In 1814, he remained to rebuild the White House and the U.S. Capitol, which was burned by the British. He and Dolly Madison furnished the White House with classical Greek-inspired furniture that was made in America, including brackets in the form of eagles, which are still in the White House, and chairs and benches painted with the Great Seal. These rooms are treasured, but by the 1950s, it was looking pretty shabby because no one really took care of it until Jackie Kennedy came to the White House and she saw the deplorable condition of these original pieces of furniture, realizing it had to be reupholstered, maybe re-gilded and whatnot in order to save it for the next generation. And she did a wonderful job, by the way. Now, Latrobe also was also to build in Baltimore the first American cathedral for any denomination. And there is, now this is the inside of the White House, done by an artist at the time, the splendid Mrs. Madison. And here is the Baltimore Cathedral that was built by Benjamin Latrobe. It took them a long time to finish it, 1806 to 1863. By that time, we were in the Civil War by that time. And there was fighting, I know, in Maryland. But there it is, and that's the way it looks today. All right, now this. This is the first photograph of any First Lady, and it's Dolly Madison, done in 1846. She struggled in later years. Her son was an alcoholic, a gambler, and went to debtor's prison, so that he had to be bailed out. She had to sell the Madison home, the slaves, and Madison's papers to the government for approximately $22,000 to $25,000 in order to have some money to bail out her son. Okay, now we're going to start talking about Robert Fulton. Born in Perth in Pennsylvania, he was a bright lad who learned to read and write before even attending school. He was sent to England by some benefactors where he became interested in steam-propelled boats. In 1797, he was in Paris, and he built a submarine that he called the Nautilus and conducted trials in the Seine River. Of course, everybody thought that he was insane doing this, but anyway, there he is in the river with this huge Nautilus. But however, the French weren't interested, and neither were the English. So he came back to the United States in 1801 and met Robert Livingston, who we talked about before, had gone to Paris. Robert Livingston had obtained a 20-year monopoly for steamboat navigation in the New York waters. 20 years only for him. Now, Fulton designed a 66-foot-long side paddle wheel boat and registered it as the Clermont. By 1810, 3 of Fulton's boats were served not only the Hudson, but also the Raritan River as well. Now, as you can see there, he's holding something on his lap. What is he holding? Well, Fulton was the first one to make a torpedo. That is a torpedo. Now, when I found that out, I said, wait a minute, Maryann, they did not have the technology for a torpedo. You need a certain technology, you need gyroscopes or whatever. The only thing I could think of, because this was done in 1807, all right, was a clockwork mechanism. You know the clock, you put and you wind the clock up? Well, it was based, that's exactly what he used. He used the clockwork mechanism in there, okay? Now, Fulton showed these models and drawings to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, Secretary of the Navy, on a clockwork mechanism, but they were lukewarm about it. On July 20th, 1807, he was given permission to blow up a small vessel in New York Harbor to prove its worth in an enemy blockade. There was a 200-ton brigantine in the harbor. He had to try 3 times before the torpedo hit the boat, and it went up in front of 2,000 people and the mayor and the governor. The brig was reduced to splinters, and as you can see in the background, there is a fire. That alludes to the fire that took place after he torpedoed that boat. So it was successful, okay? Now, well, things were not going to go very well for him in a little while. By 1824, the Supreme Court overturned Livingston's monopoly. New York State had infringed on Congress's authority to regulate interstate commerce. Within 2 years, the Fulton-Livingston Company went out of business. They failed to keep up with newer and faster boats, and one of the newer and faster boats was, let me see, by this man, John Stevens. John Stevens lived in Hoboken. As a matter of fact, he owned the whole town of Hoboken because he had a huge estate there. Now, he had attended Columbia, was a lawyer, engineer, and an inventor. He produced the first screw-driven boat in 1802. He had a shipyard in Hoboken where he was building a ship to expand into the market going up the Hudson. Now, his most famous boat was the Albany, and in it had many innovations. First of all, there were salons for ladies and gentlemen. The boat speed was also increased. You could go from New York City to Albany in 10 hours. To give the Albany cachet, however, he commissioned 12 paintings from very well-known artists such as Thomas Cole and Samuel Morse, all famous artists. These paintings were hung in the Albany, making it the very first floating art collection. This was a carefully conceived business strategy designed to guarantee success with the boat and establish the Albany as the most refined and desirable boat on the river. Now that's Thomas Cole's Last of the Mohegans. This hung in the, there's a lot of other paintings, but I'm not going to show you one. And this is in a museum today, all right? And this is Thomas Cole, Last of the Mohegans from 1826. Okay, now, this is more, Stevens did a couple of other things. Here was his house. This is an engraving of his house. In 1810, they had a big piece of property. So in 1810, he designed and constructed a steam locomotive which operated on a circular track on his New Jersey estate. It is regarded as the first locomotive built in America. Again, New Jersey. In 1815, he got the first charter ever, was granted to it in the U.S. for a railroad, was given to Stevens. This was in 1815. In 1830, 15 years later, the Camden and Amboy Railroad Company came into existence. Now, when we say Amboy, we don't mean Perth Amboy, it was South Amboy, okay? From Camden to South Amboy. The company stayed in business from 1830 to 1872. In 1832, there was another line from Trenton to New Brunswick. Now, oh, wait a minute here. Yeah, this is the locomotive. They bought this locomotive, the John Bull, from the British. All right, it was a steam locomotive, and this here is a recent photograph of it. You can see it's a much better picture, but it's still, they obviously have kept this, and they must bring it out at certain times just for people to see it, because it's certainly very interesting. All right, now, the next one here is DeWitt Clinton. He served as a U.S. Senator and Mayor of New York for 3 terms, and the Governor of New York. He presided over the building of the Erie Canal, which took 3 years, from 1825 to 1828. Many people called it Clinton's Folly or Clinton's Big Ditch, but he firmly believed in developing infrastructure in both New York and the United States. The canal was the first navigable waterway connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. The canal was a success, and the tolls from it covered the state's construction debt. The canal was built The canal was built so the goods from the Middle West were floated. Before the canal, the goods were floated down the Mississippi, then up to New York City, and it took a very long time. Now here, this is one of it's still in existence, it's still there, and it is now called the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor. Samuel Morse. I mentioned him as a painter, and indeed he did go to London to learn painting with Benjamin West. Benjamin West was an American, so all the Americans who wanted to learn to paint would go to him in London, okay? Now, he returned to Massachusetts, determined to be a history painter, but there was no market for such wares. He was appointed a professor of painting at the New York University, and Morse won a coveted honor of painting this portrait. This is the Marquis de Lafayette. When we celebrated our 50th anniversary as a country, Lafayette came from France, and he went to every state. Now, by that time, we had 24 states in our union. He stayed for a year and a half, and he went to every single state in the United States, and he was treated like a hero because he had helped us so much during the Revolution. Okay, now I should have mentioned the date of 1826 because that's when the last signer of the Declaration of Independence died. His name was Charles Carroll, and he was from Maryland. And I think I also ought to point out that in 1825, which would be 200 years from this Friday, Thomas Jefferson died in the morning, and in the afternoon, John Adams died in Massachusetts. So 2 of our founders died on the 4th of July in 1825. Now, let's see. All right, now let's go back now. This is Morse's receiver. Morse was since he couldn't make any money on painting, he began tinkering with the idea of getting a telegraph, a signal, so you could send messages on a wire. And he had a problem with it, getting the signals for more than a few yards, all right? With the help of an NYU professor, he introduced extra circuits or relays at frequent intervals. He then sent a message through 10 miles of wire, which was the breakthrough. In January of 1838, Morse made the first public demonstration of the electric telegraph at the Speedwell Iron Works in Morristown, New Jersey. Another first for New Jersey, okay? In 1843, Congress gave $30,000 for the construction of a 38-mile experimental telegraph line between Washington and Baltimore. On May 24th, the message, "What hath God wrought," was sent from the Supreme Court to the station in Baltimore. Again, another first. Morse also, here's another a drawing of his telegraph. Morse also was trying to record the human voice. And this picture was a photograph by none other than Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady met Morse through an artist friend, and Morse trained him in the newly developed technology of daguerreotype. Now, his reputation grew. That is to say, Brady's reputation grew. But the daguerreotype had a problem. It didn't last very long. It was a French invention, but it didn't last very long because when you worked with daguerreotypes, you had to use mercury to finish off the picture. And the fumes of mercury were making people ill, and in some cases they died. So they had to come up with something else that wasn't going to kill people, all right? So eventually, right about this time around late 1840s is when they came up with this is done, not a daguerreotype, this is an actual photograph. Now, the reputation of Matthew Brady grew. He had a miniature gallery on Broadway in 1844, and he won many awards photographing well-known people like Edgar Allan Poe and James Fenimore Cooper, who did one of the paintings for the Albany. Now, he later opened a studio in Washington. Brady was determined to create a comprehensive photo documentation of the war. He was actually the first war photographer, all right? People didn't know what war was, although sometimes they would go to a battlefield to see what was happening. But it was dangerous, all right? Now, he hired a group of photographers, preserved glass plate negatives, brought plates from private photographers, preserving glass plate from private photographers to make the collection as complete as possible. In 1862, in a New York exhibit at his studio, he exhibited a series of photographs of the dead of Antietam. Now, Antietam was a battle fought in 1862, and as most of you know, it was a very, very bloody battle on both sides, okay? Now, the New York Times said of this exhibit, quote, "Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war." And I am now, this is Matthew Brady. He was a very handsome guy, by the way, wasn't he? Wow. I'm going to show you 4 of the pictures from the Civil War, and the first one is going to be the first one. Oh, glory. First one is the dead in Antietam, and the Confederate dead, and I am quite sure that picture was also used in his display. So you can, for the first time, people saw what war was like. Here, the officers, I found this, the officers of the 4th New Jersey Infantry. I don't know how many infantry divisions there were, but there had to be at least 4 of them, and there they are, you know, in front of the pup tent. Now here, oh, wait a minute, now there's another one here. General Grant and his staff of 8. There's Grant standing with his stovepipe hat, and I don't see a cigar in his hand because he perpetually smoked, and that's how he died. He died of cancer. And before he died, he wrote his biography in 2 volumes to be able to provide money for his family. And here is the wounded soldiers in a hospital. Boy, I wouldn't want to be in that hospital, would you? It looks like a barn, and I can imagine all the bacteria that... Okay. Now here is Solomon Andrews. Unfortunately, Solomon Andrews was born 100 years too early. His achievements are amazing considering the limited technology and power sources of the 19th century. Andrews was a physician and the mayor of Perth Amboy for 3 terms. All right, now, a lot of inventions he had a lot of patents. 24 inventions are credited to him. A kitchen range, a sewing machine, a gas lamp, and also a pick-proof lock, a lock that could not be picked. And he had a 30-year federal contract to supply them to the government. Okay, He was a jack of all trades. He was not only the mayor, he was the justice of the peace. He was the president of the Board of Health. Remember cholera and yellow fever. And he also was the collector of taxes for the port of Perth Amboy for the federal government. Okay. But Solomon Andrews, well, I am going to punch a little hole in something that you believe. You believe that the Wright brothers were the first to fly. Well, you know what? I'm going to show you something different. Whoops. Oh, golly molly. Ow. This was Ariane number 1. This is Solomon Andrews' balloon that he took aloft. This is the Ariane number 1. 3 80 feet long, 13 feet wide balloons with seven internal cells containing hydrogen. The gondola was 12 feet long. A network of suspension cables allowed the crew to change the inclination of the flight. Ariane could lift 600 pounds, including the pilot, and up to 3 passengers and ballast. Now, Ariane could easily be moved around. Ariane could point into the wind and then maintain an upward course. The first flight was over Perth Amboy on June 1st, 1863. 3 subsequent flights were made demonstrating that it could fly against the wind, make 360-degree turns, and navigate back to land. Now, in 1864, he flew one of his Arianes for 30 miles in 14 and a half minutes. So he was going 2 miles a minute, which was quite fast in those days. Now, in July 5th, 1864, the U.S. Patent Office granted a patent for the Ariane. Andrews offered it to the government, to Union Army, but they declined. Now, it would have been a good idea because then they could have tracked the way the Confederates were moving, but they refused. And this was in 1864. The war ended in 1865. Now, here is oh, I don't know why this is doing this. I'm sorry. Now, when I was preparing this lecture, I suddenly remembered that somebody had given me a book a number of years ago, a paperback, that was published in Perth Amboy in 1937, and it was about the history of Perth Amboy. And when I opened it up, there was this engraving of the Ariane number 1. You can see the 3 balloons, and I don't know what the balloons were made of. I really don't. I mean, they wouldn't be rubber. I suppose that maybe they would be a heavy canvas. I don't know what else they would have used, okay? And there it is, the ship, the boat, it's sailing along. Now, this was the first one, but he made some little changes to Ariane number 2. Here is Ariane number 2 from 1866. It's a single hull design, and it looks kind of like a flattened lemon. They control the buoyancy by using a complex set of ropes and pulleys to squeeze or release the external pressure on the hydrogen gas bags. In May 25th, 1866, they launched it from Lower Manhattan. It flew up the Fifth Avenue, north to Harlem, across the East River into Astoria, Queens. It reached a maximum altitude of 2,000 feet. And because he was sure that people would probably get scared. They see this thing and they run like crazy. So he had cards made up, and here are the cards. And they were thrown down from the place so that everybody would, oh, look at this. Oh, that's that Mr. Andrews who's doing these flights. Okay, so they didn't have to be scared. So that's there it is now. For the second flight on the Ariane, he had a larger rudder. They experienced flight control problems, but landed safely in Brookfield, Long Island, about 90 minutes and 30 miles from Manhattan. On this flight, they reached an altitude of 6,000 feet. Now that's pretty high, okay? This was This second flight was Andrew's last flight. He realized that he had hoped in 1865, he hoped to create a company, chartered a company for transportation from New York to Philadelphia, which would be kind of handy, wouldn't it? But the post-Civil War economic crisis and the bank failures doomed the project. And in 1865, Andrews wrote a book called The Art of Flying. If you ever find it in a bookstore or in a used bookstore, you ought to buy it up because it's probably worth a lot of money. Now, I want to bring some other ladies into this lecture. I'm not ignoring the gals. This is a lady named Hetty Green. She was the heiress to her family's fortune. During the Gilded Age, she was the richest woman in America and known as the Queen of Wall Street. She was close to her father. She read him the financial page at the age of 6, and by the age of 13, she became the family bookkeeper. The father put her in charge of the family's finances, so she would learn things, okay? Now, she was frugal and shunned society or any partnership. And she wrote, whether rich or poor, a woman should know how a bank account works, understand the complexities of mortgages and bonds, and know the value of interest and how it accumulates, unquote. Now, in 1907 and 08, there was a panic, financial panic in the United States. It was a complete meltdown of our financial system. Nobody knew what to do. Along comes this man, J.P. Morgan, all right? And you can go to his house on Lexington Avenue and 35th Street. You can go in there. You can go into his office. You can walk through the whole building. He has something like, I believe he has 2 copies of the copy of the Magna Carta, and I think he's got 2 original Bibles and whatnot. Okay, but we're going to talk about what happened that day. J.P. Morgan called all the financiers and bankers to his office. I believe it was a Friday night. He locked the door and said no one would leave until they all came to an agreement to halt the panic. Well, naturally, people wanted to go home and eat, okay? Now, Hetty Green was the only woman in that room with all those money men. She helped bail out New York City with a loan of $1.1 million in 1908 dollars, not 2025 dollars, okay? So in other words, we had to bail out New York 100 years ago, okay? So it's going to happen again, I'm sure. Okay. Now, here's another lady, Madam C.J. Walker. You've probably heard things about her. She was born in Louisiana on a plantation to sharecropper parents. She wasn't born a slave. She was born in 1867, all right? She was orphaned by the age of 7, and she worked in the cotton fields. At 14, she married a man to escape her cruel brother-in-law. In 1885, she gave birth to her only daughter, and she was widowed by the age of 20. Now, here is a woman, basically illiterate, with a small baby. So she went to St. Louis, where she had 4 brothers who were barbers. She had a total of 3 months of education in Sunday school in literary classes so that she could learn to read. That was the sole amount of her education, 3 months. Now, she suffered from hair loss and experimented with home remedies and products from another woman named Annie Malone. In 1905, she moved to Denver as a sales agent for Malone, but she concocted a scalp conditioning and other healing products and sold them in the streets for 50 cents. By the end of her life, she had a lavish estate in Irvington, New York, a social gathering place for Afro-American community. She was a philanthropist. She gave money to the NAACP, the Tuskegee Endowment, which we're going to talk about in a little while, the scholarships for women, unusual to give a scholarship for a woman, the Black YMCA, and other charities as well. I have 3 quotes from Madam C.J. Walker. The first one is, "I got my start by giving myself a start." The second one, "It's pretty hard for the Lord to guide you if you haven't made up your mind which way to go." And number 3, "America doesn't respect anything but money. What our people need is a few millionaires. Okay. Now, the next is John Philip Sousa. Sousa enlisted in the Marine Corps band at the age of 13, but then he left to join a pit orchestra to learn conducting and also wanted to learn how to play on the violin. In 1880, he returned to the Marine Band and developed it into the premier military band. Between 1892 and 1931, they performed at 15,623 concerts, and the 1900 World Exposition in Paris, where the band marched through the streets to the Arc de Triomphe. Here is a picture of the sheet music, and it says there, composed expressly for and played the first time at the dedication of the Lafayette Monument, Paris, July 4th, 1900. The band also performed at the Royal Albert Hall in London, and in 1911 they played at the Palladium. He was a very prolific musician. I don't think this guy ever slept. He wrote 130 marches, 15 operettas, 24 dances, ad infinitum. It was fabulous. The Stars and Stripes Forever, which is now the national march of the United States. Now, he even invented the sousaphone. Maybe he thought his band didn't have enough brass. So I got this wonderful picture of these sousaphones. So anyway, you will see them, in the Macy Parade, when they have the brass bands, you will see these big sousaphones. I don't even know how you carry these things. They must be enormous and very, very heavy. So there it is. This was in Provo, Utah in 2011. Here's a picture. I didn't put a caption because you all know what it is. Unless you've been sleeping like Rip Van Winkle, you all know what this is. Okay. Roebling and the Brooklyn Bridge. John Roebling was a German immigrant and a brilliant engineer. While surveying for the location of the bridge, he had an accident that crushed his toes. Disregarding medical advice, he washed his foot with water that was contaminated. He developed tetanus and he died. So he could not continue on that. His son, Washington Roebling, was also a bridge builder. And he'd also served in the Union Army as well. And he worked on the project for 14 years. He was to die as a result of the bends, which are nitrogen bubbles in the bloodstream. We all have nitrogen in our body, okay? And at street level, you're fine. But once you go down, the bubbles expand and you have to come up very slowly. Otherwise, you will get something called the bends, and it can lead to just about instantaneous death. And I do know somebody who died of the bends. I do know someone who had that. Now, by 1872, he could no longer visit the site of the bridge. He observed the progress through a telescope. His wife, and I'm going to have, oh, right here. I love this picture because it looks like a diamond necklace, doesn't it? And if you look in the very, 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 very top, you're going to see a little white thing that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes, all right? Here is John Roebling and Washington Roebling, and here is Emily Roebling, because she was the one. His wife Emily trained herself as an engineer and would take her husband's directives to the workers every day. Okay, so she was also involved in this because her husband was basically an invalid. Now here, first of all, I'm going to give you the bridge statistics, okay? Begun in 1869, finished in 1883. The total length is 6,016 feet. Clearance at the center is 135 feet. It was the most daring engineer project of the 19th century. The towers rose 300 feet above the water, an astonishing height at that time. Now here is the building of the stone towers, okay? Now these stone towers stand on caissons. Now I'm going to change it. Wait a minute here. No. Now the caissons. Digging in an atmosphere of compressed air was very dangerous. The caissons were large wooden boxes with no bottoms. They were towed into the position and sunk in the water. The men dug away at the mud to reach bedrock upon which the bridge would sit. The only illumination were gas lamps, and the sandhogs had to pass through a series of airlocks to prevent, again, getting the bends. The massive stone towers were built atop the caissons. Now, the Brooklyn caisson is 44 feet below water, but the Manhattan caisson is 78 feet below water. In other words, the bed of the river was not straight, it was like this, okay? Now, I'm going to show you something else. This is a picture taken of the bridge in progress. Let me see now. And you can see some men standing up there. And there is a sign there, so I enlarged the picture to figure out what the sign was. The sign says, "Safe for only 25 men at one time. Do not walk close together. Do not jump or trot. Break step. W.A. Roebling, engineer in charge," unquote. They are standing on a footbridge put in place in 1877 for use of bridge workers, but daring people who obtained special permission could walk across it. Now that was, you know, and if you fell off, you wouldn't sue anybody. You wanted to do it, so you did it and you fell. Okay, this reminded me of something, and I know you probably remember this. Do you remember the Frenchman Philippe Petit, who strung a wire between the two World Trade Center, and the cops in New York went crazy because there he is walking across on the wire, and they're telling him to come back, and they put him in handcuffs, and the whole police troops, they all went crazy because he wasn't supposed to do that. All right, so anyway, okay, so that was during the construction of the bridge. Now here is something else. This is the cables that were made of galvanized steel wire. They are 15.75 inches in diameter, containing 5,282 parallel cables wrapped closely together and together in a cylindrical shape. The length of the main suspension span is 1,595 feet. These cables were produced by the Roebling factory outside of Trenton, New Jersey. So the cables came from New Jersey. Now here is another lady you may have heard of. Edith Wharton was the lady who chronicled the Gilded Age. She was a prolific writer. She wrote 40 books in 40 years. Most of them are still in print. She was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1921 for The Age of Innocence, which was made into a wonderful movie directed by Martin Scorsese, and it was recently on Netflix. Now, she also received a gold medal for fiction and was admitted to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She moved to France just before World War I, and when the war started, she didn't run away, she stayed. Remained there using her money for charity, building homes and schools for refugees, and also workrooms for the unemployed, and also opened 3 hospitals for the injured. After the war, she was awarded the Légion d'honneur. This is her pavilion, her garden outside of Paris. She had an estate outside of Paris, and this is a picture of the garden. All right, another lady, Nellie Bly. This is the first investigative reporter. She wrote a column in Pittsburgh. She wrote a reply to a column in Pittsburgh, to the Pittsburgh Dispatch. The editor was impressed and he hired her. But she wanted to do real reporting, so she went to New York City, to the New York World, which at that time was owned by the Pulitzer family. She heard about a place called Blackwell's Island. So she took an undercover assignment to investigate reports of brutality and neglect at the New York City Mental Health Hospital on Blackwell's Island. In order to get into the asylum, she pretended to be insane. And the police took her to the asylum. There she gathered observations and saw at first hand the abuses and deplorable conditions. After 10 days, she was released. Her report, 10 Days in a Madhouse, led to reforms and made her famous. Her writings also shed light on the experiences of marginalized women. Now, after that, she was the first investigative reporter. Think of Woodward and Bernstein. Think of Maggie Haberman for the New York Times. Woodward and Bernstein for the Washington Post. And when they went to the boss and he said, I don't know about this, they said, look, we've got the proof. All right, he said, you can go with it. And he finally gave them permission to continue with the investigation. And we know what that happened. The whole apple cart was thrown over. Now, so she then suggested to her editor, and Pulitzer always liked publicity. He was crazy for publicity. So she went to Pulitzer and she said she wanted to take the book Around the World in 80 Days, was done by Jules Verne, and from fiction to fact. Smart move. She became famous as the paper reported her adventures. The newspaper offered a grand prize to readers who would estimate her arrival time back in New York. So, her itinerary. Well, first she went to England, then she went to France where she met Jules Verne, then to Brindisi, Italy. It's a very nice town. I've been there once for one of my birthdays. I spent it in Brindisi, Italy. Suez Canal, Ceylon, Penang, and Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan. She traveled alone for most of the journey. That was a first because a woman could only travel with a male relative or her husband. A woman traveling alone was suspect. Maybe she's a scarlet woman if she's traveling alone, okay? So, in other words, it was another barrier that a woman broke, so that we are free now to get into a bus if we want to take a bus ride, okay? Now, here is the mental hospital, okay? Here is Sheasley. I'm sorry, she left on November 14th, came back on January 25th. She traveled 24,898 miles in 72 days. And here, oh gosh, here is an engraving of her arrival back in New York City. And that was in one of the newspapers at the time. Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. In 1896, these two geniuses met at a convention for Edison Electric. Ford spoke to him, and Edison told Ford, keep on working with that car because that is the car of the future, he said. Those cars you're putting out. They were exchanging messages, and they began exchanging messages and birthday greetings. In 1816, they actually became neighbors. Ford buying an estate next to Edison's in Fort Myers, Florida. Their homes are preserved for the tourists. Now, the greatest invention, of course, of Edison was the invention of the light bulb. The first street lights in America were at Christie Street in Edison, New Jersey, where he had his studio, and so he put street lights on the whole street. Now, he is also responsible for the first phonograph to record voice and music, and motion pictures that began in the Black Maria in West Orange, New Jersey, and where the first movies were made. In other words, Edison gifted the world with the entertainment choices we have today. His birthday should be a national holiday. And there is the Black Maria. Oh dear. Oh, come on. Here is the Black Maria. And it had a roof you could raise up in order to make it, if you needed more light. But the reason why they went out, the weather in New Jersey wasn't so good. So that's when they decided to go to California, where the weather was better. And that's the reason why movies were made in California. Now here were two, again, I'm using Walter Chrysler and Henry Ford here. A salute to two automobile pioneers. Ford for his innovation of the production line, still used by automakers to this day with computer technology. No more heavy lifting of the motors into the chassis. Chrysler for his beautiful cars. My dad had a Chrysler and so did I. But Walter Chrysler also left us another gift. And here it is. The Chrysler Building. This was not intended at Chrysler's headquarters. It was intended as a real estate investment for his kids. It really, though, became a gift to New York City. It's not the tallest building. It's not the tallest, but it's the most beautiful one. At a height of 1,046 feet, it is the tallest brick building in the world. An architectural treasure capped with a series of Art Deco arches forming a 125-foot spire reaching to the heavens. There was a special steel developed by the German company Krupp with 18% chromium and 8% nickel to give brightness to the steel. Now they started this building in 1928. Krupp was the same person that created all the steel for Hitler's panzers. And that, as you know, happened by 1939. Okay. Now, the architect was a man named William Van Allen. And by the way, what you see here, is carried into the interior of the building. So in other words, the interior, it echoes what you see on the outside. It's world famous. It's been in the movies. Sex and the City, Spider-Man, and also Godzilla. It also has its own zip code, 10174. Now we're going to Dr. Frederick Albee. Dr. Albee was internationally famous for his work in repairing shattered bones by war or accident. His book on the subject was considered the gold standard. Even into the 20th century, shattered limbs were still being removed so that the person had no arm or leg. But Dr. Albee preferred using bone grafts. Rarely used, but Dr. Albee did bone grafts even of the jaw, which are very difficult because the jaw is as hard as ivory. He demonstrated his procedures in Europe and was decorated by 16 nations. In 1917, the first hospital was constructed with funds from Congress with Dr. Albee in charge. It was known as U.S. Hospital Number 3. Don't forget the war was still going on, 1917. And the U.S. Hospital Number 3 was located in Colonia, New Jersey. Hospital Number 1 was going to be in Washington, and Hospital Number 2 was going to be in Boston, but they were never built. The only one that was built was Dr. Albee's, because he was getting all the men with shattered limbs from the First World War. Now, in February of 1918, the construction began on land from the estate of Charles Freeman, who, hearing of Dr. Albee's need for a site, gave him 200 acres in Colonia. On June 3rd, between February and June, they had this whole thing built. It only took 3 months to build it. I don't know how they did it so fast, because any other government projects today can drag on for 10 or 15 years. Okay. The construction began on February 1918, and on June 3rd in 1918, the first admission of patients to the hospital, which accommodated 500 to 1,000 patients in 110 buildings spread over 200 acres with 2,000 beds, a swimming pool, a central heating plant, 5 kitchens, and a fire department. The cost was $3.5 million, but it was the most complete hospital in this country because it had all the necessary services for these men. You didn't have to take them somewhere else for therapy or whatever. Now, between July 1918 and October 1919, 6,000 wounded came to Colonia. The majority of these were returned to active civilian life. On October 1919, they closed the hospital, and he and his wife sailed on the Mauretania to a rehab conference in Rome. Now, this is the house, Blythemore, that was at 125 Dover Road, and well, I live at 125 Dover Road. I live on the Albee property, and there was a marker on my this was purely happens chance when I went to the builder who was a member of my church. I asked him, Joe, do you have any more property available? Oh, he said, Maryann, I've got all 4 plots. So I had first choice, and I didn't know that I was taking the 125 Dover Road until after, of course, I moved in and got that as my address. So, and here is Dr. Albee in 1918, the first spinal bone graft in the U.S. Hospital number 3 in Colonia, New Jersey. There's the picture of it. And he was doing, again, a spinal bone graft for someone that has tuberculosis of the spine. And everybody knows that in the 19th century, tuberculosis was a scourge. It hit so many thousands of people and killed them. But this was a bone graft for a spinal bone graft for someone that had tuberculosis of the spine. Now here is Hedy Lamarr. How many of you know Hedy Lamarr, who she is? Okay, sure. She was famous for her beauty that propelled her to movie stardom. Hetty Kiesler, however, had another side to herself. Born in Austria to a wealthy family, by the time she was 5 years old, she took apart her music box to see how it worked and then put it back together again. By the time she was 10 years old, she was a competent pianist. Her mother taught her to do the piano, and she could speak 4 languages, including English. In 1938, because she was so beautiful, she became under contract to MGM in such films as Algiers with Charles Boyer, Ziegfeld, Samson and Delilah with Cecil B. DeMille, Boomtown and Comrade X, which was a comedy with Clark Gable. They very rarely show Comrade X, but it's very, very funny. She plays the part of a Russian, and Clark Gable is an American, and she is she runs a bus in Moscow, and she's a committed communist, but it really is very, very funny. Now, and she was famed for her beauty, but she said, quote, "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid." Okay. Now, in 1941, and here is where Brandon got this wonderful picture of her. She was working with a music composer who composed music for the movies, including the Pride and the Passion with Sophia Loren. The music for that was done by Charles Antheil. They began working on a secret communication system, which she patented and offered to the U.S. Navy. They refused it and told her she should sell war bonds. So she did. She went out and sold. A lot of movie stars went out to sell war bonds because we desperately needed that money. Now, her invention is now referred to as frequency hopping, pertaining to a way for radio or transmitters to jump from one frequency to another. This way, any enemy interception of classified signals and messages would be stymied, all right? Lamarr's idea propelled the advent of the transistor and is used to this day in wireless communication such as GPS, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi. Beauty and brain, she had it all. Remember that the next time you use your GPS. Now, I told you I was going to talk about Tuskegee. Remember I mentioned that with Madam C.G. Walker. The Tuskegee was selected by the U.S. Army because they already had a proven civilian pilot training program. Between 1941 and 1946, they trained 1,000 black men who were trained as pilots and later as navigators or bombardiers. They were known as the Red Tails because the back of their, I'm going to show you a color picture of the back of the plane. There was a red tail on it, okay? Now, here it is. There's the red tail. You see, this is the kind of thing they flew in. Now, the statistics. The 332nd Fighter Group The airmen's success was in escorting the bombers in World War II, had one of the lowest loss records, and were in constant demand for their services by the Allied bombing units. In other words, these were the ones that didn't do the bombing, but they went with them to be able to fend off the enemy. Now, the 99th Squadron was awarded 2 presidential unit citations in 1943 for aerial bombing in the 12th Air Force in Italy, and another in 1944. 2 pilots flying Thunderbolts bombed a German destroyer in the harbor of Trieste, Italy. And another citation in 1945 for the longest bomber escort mission to Brazil. Again, you had the bombers, but you also had the escort that went with them to fight off any impending from the enemy. In 1948, President Truman gave Executive Order 9981, which directed equality of treatment and opportunity in all of the U.S. Armed Forces, which led to the end of racial segregation in all the military forces. Now, here is one man named Harry Stewart. I put him in here because he died not 3 or 4 months ago, born on July the 4th. In one dogfight, Harry Stewart downed 2 enemy planes. He then received a radio warning of a German plane behind him. He did a 180 and shot down that 3rd plane, and he received the Distinguished Flying Cross. And I put him in here. This is, of course, a picture from the time. You can see by the sepia tone of it. But I put him in here because this was just an example of one. And the Tuskegee Airmen were, when the bombers went out, they wanted the Tuskegee guys to come with them because they were so well trained. Now, oh golly molly! All right, now we're coming to the middle of the 20th century. Jonas Salk was the first man who formulated a successful polio vaccine. He refused to patent it, believing it belonged to humanity, quote unquote. The research began in 1947, and by 1952 he had inoculated volunteers and himself, his wife, and his 3 kids. He gave them the polio vaccine to make sure that it would, and he could possibly have taken one of them, okay? Now, 1953 was the worst year for polio in this country, with 57,628 cases. When I say photos by Yusuf Karsh was an Armenian. He came to Canada. He went to Canada and became a very famous photographer who photographed all the celebrities and famous people, including, you may remember the bulldog portrait of Winston Churchill, where he looks so angry. The reason why he's angry is he came into the studio when he had a cigar, and Yusuf Karsh took the cigar away from him. He didn't like that. He wanted the cigar. So anyway, but these 2 pictures are by Yusuf Karsh, and beautifully done too. That's beautiful. And this is another lady. You may have never heard of this lady, but I want to make her famous again. She was born in Canada and came to the U.S. in 1936 to the University of Chicago as a research assistant and PhD candidate in pharmacology, which she received in 1938. That was unusual, to have a PhD in pharmacology for a woman. The same year, a pill for infections killed 107 Americans. An investigation led to the sweet flavoring of the pill. Wait a minute, now control. I've got to get my other page. Sorry. It turned out the sweetening of the pill turned out to be antifreeze. In 1938, there was public outrage about this. You're giving these people poison. The Congress passed the first Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1938. Everything had to go through this branch of the government. By 1960, Kelsey is now the head of the NDA, which was the new drug application. If you had formulated a new drug, you had to give it to the government and let them test it, okay? Now, Richardson Merrill sent in their application for Kevadon. That was the name they were going to market it on, but it was something called thalidomide. Do you know what the thalidomide is? Okay, you don't, but you will in a minute, okay? Now, Kelsey found multiple omissions in the application and the data, which was merely testimonials, not hard facts. By this time, by the way, Richardson Merrill was distributing the drug in free samples. There was a side effect to the drug, neuritis. It would inflame the nerves. She suspected that Richardson Merrill knew about the problem, but they were not forthcoming. By this time, Richardson Merrill was very angry at her. They called her a chemist, which she was not. She was a PhD in pharmacology and also an MD, by the way. And they also made smarmy remarks about her looks. She prevented the drug from being sold in the United States. One woman standing up to Big Pharma. Now, between 1957 and 1962, more than 10,000 infants were affected by the thalidomide, and many died in utero. It was released to Canada, Great Britain, Japan, West Germany, New Zealand, and Australia. The U.S. had 17 cases, and how could they give them the case? Obviously, somebody took the samples. These children were born without arms or legs. In other words, I've seen a thalidomide victim in one of my trips to New Zealand. He had hands, little fingers that stuck out from his shoulders. He had feet, but he had no legs, so he could not walk. He was probably about 30 inches. It looked the size of a doll. He could not feed himself. He could not brush his teeth. And when I saw this, I asked my friend, I said, Diane, I said, what do they do with these people? She said, Maryann, the government pays for each of them to have a caretaker. Can you imagine if it had happened in our country and 20 or 30,000 children were born like that? The expense, the anguish. So this woman to me is a hero and deserves to be in this lecture. Now, this is, there she, oh, golly, why does it do this? In 1962, she received the Distinguished Federal Civilian Service Award, the second woman to receive this honor. Kelsey stayed with the FDA until she was 90 years old. They needed her. She stayed. She retired then, and she died at 101 in 2015. Very few people know her name, but she should be very well known. And President Kennedy gave her this because he realized she was the only one standing between absolute horrendous things and Richardson Merrill. I don't know what happened to the company. I don't believe they're in business anymore. They may have gone out of business or may have been taken over. I don't know, but they don't exist anymore. All right, here's John Glenn. 7 astronauts were accepted into the Mercury project. John Glenn was selected to be the first astronaut to go aloft in the Mercury 7 capsule. In 1962, he circled the Earth for 3 times in the capsule. The capsule was very small, and in order to reduce the weight in the capsule, John Glenn went on a diet and had to lose 30 pounds to make the thing more buoyant. Okay, now from 1974 to 1999, he served as senator from Ohio. All right, here is the Apollo mission. July 16th. How many of you remember the Apollo mission? It was wonderful. It was a grand time to be alive and see all this stuff. It was fabulous. Oh, wow. And July 16th, 1969, when John Kennedy was president, he promised that he said, I am going to, they were going to start the space project. He wanted to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely by the end of this decade, which of course was the 1960s. So this was the last opportunity, 1969, for it to happen when he wished it. Now, This is the first crew to land on the moon. On July 20th, Neil Armstrong, who you see there on the left, was the first to set foot on the moon, and he said when he set his feet on the moon, quote, "One small step for man, one giant step for mankind." It was an 8-day mission. They collected lunar samples, solar wind samples, deployed scientific instrumentation, and also a seismometer to determine whether or not there were earthquakes on the moon. Here's again a lighting off from the capsule. Remember this picture from the beginning? Well, we've come a long way, baby, haven't we? Okay, now this is Robert Jarvik. Dr. Jarvik was the principal designer of the first permanent artificial heart implanted in a human being. In 1982, the FDA gave permission for the device to be implanted. Dr. Jarvik is on the left, and on the right is Dr. William DeVries, who implanted the heart in a man named in Barney Clark, a retired dentist. He survived for 112 days, attached to a 400-pound compressor that helped the Jarvik pump blood through his body. The man who lived the longest was William Schroeder. He lived for 620 days. But the thing is, they had to stay in the hospital because they were tethered to the compressor, okay? Now, the design became smaller. Today they are the size of a C battery and are implanted in the body. In 2023, there was a study. There were 1,700 patients worldwide walking around with a heart like this. Now, this is a quote from my doctor, Dr. Buck of Menlo Park Medical Group. The Jarvik 7 allowed for further research into the development of a device that would permanently replace the heart when the transplants were not feasible. This led to the development of the heart-lung machine, enabling doctors to operate on the heart, correct problems, and restart the heart. It has saved the lives of thousands of people, including my mother, who lived for 14 and a half years after her surgery with me in the home I built for us in Colonia at 125 Dover Road. So I'm very happy for that. Now I'm going to show you something else. This is a little bit of a digression, but I think you'll be interested in seeing this. This is a drone that was developed by Northrop Grumman. I know about this drone. I've learned about it because the man who was my companion for 7 years worked on this project, okay? He was one of the leaders in the project, quite frankly. I found this out from his colleagues after he died. This is the defense industries are on the cutting edge, developing new and safer techniques for defense. For example, Raytheon has its Patriot missile system and Northrop Grumman with this drone. It was a U.S. Navy project called the Triton. I'm going to show you later on pictures of the memento that Lou got when it had the first flight. The Triton. It was called the Triton because it was a Navy project. It had its first flight in 2013, which is 12 years ago. The wingspan of this drone is 150 feet and can be refueled in flight and fly above radar. As a matter of fact, that's how they got the picture. They were coming in to fuel it, and that's the way they got this wonderful picture. Now, my late companion, Louis Laskowski, was instrumental in this project that continued into 2021. The equipment that was inside the drone had to be tested. And they wanted to test it to see if it could withstand a thunderstorm or some kind of ray being shot at the drone, all right? So they put the Triton in a hangar, and they bombarded it with electricity for at least 1 hour. This was as dangerous a test as it could have started a fire. They had to be very careful. They're dealing with electricity after all. Afterwards, all the equipment on the drone, aboard the drone, was tested to see if all was operational. Lou was in charge of this test, and his team members told me how important he was. This equipment works. The Navy was constantly, however, revising the parameters and changes to be made. And in 2021, with the pandemic on, the contract was canceled. Now the Triton, they also would take the skin off the Triton. This was told to me just 2 days ago by one of Lou's colleagues. He said we would take the skin off the Triton when we did software updates, because we put the software in and then we had to test each piece of equipment to detect any glitches in the software. So now I want to show you this. This is the picture. On the right it says the first flight of the Triton. There it is. And there's the Triton itself, and there it says the first flight was in 2013. So they had obviously been working on this from probably about 2 or 3 years before. Now the Navy still has this technology, of course. I mean, not the Navy, Northrop Grumman still has the technology and can use it. So I wanted to end with showing you a drone which is much bigger than the drones you see, the little ones and whatnot. Okay, so I want to thank you all for your time and attention. And if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. Thank you very much. Thank you.